Welcome to this policy perspective session. We're aiming with this to explore the role of citizen science and participatory research in evidence-based policy making. We've got two really good speakers who are going to give us their perspective of this in practice. Following both presentations, we'll then have a Q&A session. So our first speaker will be Professor Jennifer Gabrys, Chair in Media, Culture and Environment in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. Jennifer leads the Planetary Praxis Research Group and is Principal Investigator on the European Research Council funded project Smart Forests, Transforming Environments into Social Political Technologies. She's also led the Citizen Sense and Air Kit projects, which are funded again by the ERC, and these are participatory and practice-based research projects that address air pollution and citizen engagement. Following Jennifer, we'll have a presentation from Achla Joshi, a policy analyst at Health Canada. Achla's work has centred on exploring the potential for citizen science and participatory research in a health research context, including how to leverage the approach and improve uptake in a policy-making context. She has a particular interest in exploring how participatory research models can be used to support diversity and representation in data. So without further ado, if Jennifer's ready, I'd like to invite her to speak.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Becky, and it's really great to be a part of this event and to see all of the work that UKRI, FSA, and others are doing in this space. So I was going to speak today a bit about the work on air quality sensing with communities that we've done, touching on policy at the end. I feel like probably a lot of other people are working quite intensively in policy, so I don't in any way claim to have an extensive expertise in this area, but I've found myself contributing to policy in various ways through this citizen sensing work. So I'll speak to that as part of this project. But what the Citizen Sense project did was really look at how to work with communities to monitor air quality. And I think what's probably distinctive about this is it very much worked with communities in projects they already had underway. So rather than recruitment being about designing a study and then getting people involved in it, we were very much learning about people's environmental monitoring projects that were already underway. So we very much entered into the middle of people's existing sorts of engagements with environmental pollution. And I think in this way, I'll speak to how citizen science, citizen sensing created forms of citizen infrastructure. So just to give you a quick kind of overview on the citizen sensing project and the issue of air pollution, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. Of course, air pollution is a planetary health hazard. It's the leading cause of environmental pollution deaths. Figures really vary, but estimates are around 8 to 9 million globally, combined indoor and outdoor air quality issues. And it affects, of course, human health, but also sustainable development and can contribute to climate change. And we could say that air pollution is not just something that people monitor and they get a number and sort of go away and think, oh, the air quality is good or bad, but rather they're very much connecting it to the environments they live in. So this is something that we noticed as part of working with communities, that citizen sensing and citizen science were already really bound up with how people experience their urban environments and rural environments, and various sorts of campaigns they might be making in relation to an environmental justice and inequality. So the Citizen Sense project really wanted to study how and whether sensors could contribute to improving people's engagement with air pollution. Did this data actually democratize engagement, as many of the devices claimed? And what other forms of participation really grew up out of these sensor devices? We planned to work with off-the-shelf sensors, but we found this project sort of has been going for about 10 years now, that in the early days, we really had to start building our own devices, which was somewhat of an unplanned activity, but it allowed us to really understand how these sensors worked and to also build our own infrastructure of engagement, as it were. But as I mentioned, we were not starting our own project sort of as a tabula rasa. We were really trying to understand what communities were already doing. I'm sure, as probably many of you know, many participants and many citizens have already been monitoring environments with diffusion tubes. So these are not digital methods, but rather things that you can easily affix to a lamppost and understand nitrogen dioxide levels. Of course, it requires sending your sample off to a lab after usually 4 weeks of gathering air pollution data, and really gives you a one-time number for that location. So here's an example of a project in Deptford where communities were doing this. They were trying to demonstrate high levels of pollution. Here they were trying to contest the development of the Thames super sewer, as it's colloquially known, and to suggest that we're already high levels of pollution and that the further development in the area could cause problems. Of course, they weren't successful with that campaign, but it was a context in which to learn more about their existing practices and to see how and whether something like digital sensors could inform the ways that people were monitoring air quality and trying to form various campaigns about changes in the urban environment and things that they also wanted to see done in the urban environment. So we did several iterations of this, and there was a whole sort of project we did in Deptford and New Cross, which you can find on our website. But I wanted to then draw attention to the proof of concept project we developed from this, which was an attempt to build a citizen infrastructure called AirKit, where we brought together all of the components that we developed through field testing with citizens, through building platforms so people could look at their data, and also various ways of narrating the data so that it could be communicated and circulated to policymakers, stakeholders, and other community members. So this was another small grant from the ERC to try to bring all of our infrastructure together into something that communities could use both in the locations where we were already working, but also we hoped farther afield that it could become a sort of self-sustaining infrastructure. So this was really bringing together things like a logbook with instructions for how to build sensors, and you can find this on our GitHub page. As well as it's available as a PDF. We have instructions for how to build your own sensors. Of course, we realize not many people will necessarily be so inclined to build DIY sensors, even though they are quite sort of low tech. So we do have the option to contact us and check out sensors from our sensor library. And we also have this AirSift platform that we developed so people could map their sensor locations, look at the various readings over time, and to create data stories from their data. So I'm just going to show you a bit about how we did our community collaboration. I mean, here we were quite fortunate because we had also already run some projects in Southeast London. We had community groups coming to us wanting to work together. And I would say, this is a further sort of issue for consideration is not just the longevity of projects, which is certainly an important consideration, but what happens when you start to build infrastructures for community engagement, but you don't necessarily have the personnel and the resources to respond to all of the requests that you receive to set up sensor networks. So I would say that is a little bit of a problem that we found ourselves in, is having the resources, the time, the personnel to make this a kind of self-sustaining operation, because people really benefit from having sort of engagement with the university, even though they are doing their own studies. But here we had a group called Clean Air SE23 in Forest Hill get in touch with us, and they were more broadly connected to a number of institutions and organizations in Forest Hill, including the Horniman, for instance, So we did a study where we went around and looked at pollution sources. Kind of classic part of our method was to do a walk and to identify and map where pollution might be occurring, to then identify where we would set up sensors. And so we had a number of sensor locations. We were very much scuppered by COVID at this point, just because we were getting our monitoring network up. Everything was going into lockdown. So that did affect the extent of our network. The other thing that we did manage to do, which was quite exciting, was work with Lewisham Council to start to get some of our sensors up on lampposts. And just as we had this vision of our dust boxes going around the South Circular in SE23, we were not able to sort of realize that to its full extent. But nevertheless, this is a proof of concept. I think it's something that could be picked up again. And here you can see the first wave of data stories where we did find, I suppose, inevitably pollution along roadways. We worked with the Dalmain School, which had its own sort of air quality campaign in putting up green screens, a very active parent group and students in wanting to address air quality, not just through monitoring, but through interventions. So that's the way that we were then looking at how to move from citizen science to citizen infrastructure. And here I would say it's infrastructure in a couple of senses. One is obviously to build this monitoring infrastructure and hopefully it becomes something that can be self-generating among communities so that they can really pick up these tools and start to use them themselves. They can analyze the data, there are instructions, and they can also communicate and narrate that through our data stories tools. But also this is infrastructure in another sense that it's, I suppose, working with the fact that people already tuned into their built environments, monitoring air quality, not just for the sake of the data, but because they want to make proposals for how to transform their environments and make more livable worlds. So I think this is a really interesting outcome and next step in the sense that, of course, it points the way to how to think about citizen infrastructure as part of a project of citizen monitoring and how to create actions, installations, interventions that are really responding to the data that is found. So I write about this a bit to get to the policy aspect of this in a report collection from the Center for Science and Policy at Cambridge. I think some of the participants who are, and some of the audience members who are in the group today have also contributed to this collection on future directions for citizen science and public policy. But just thinking around this problem of infrastructures and how to really think about citizen contributions and how they start to become part of the infrastructure of also creating policy and thinking about how to improve environments. It's a bit of a long URL, but you can find that there. Of course, you could just search for it online. There's many other interesting sorts of contributions on citizen science in that. And then really recently, really just a week ago, as part of the DEFRA social science expert group, I had the privilege to contribute to a review of public engagement with Susan Owens and other colleagues, Steve Hinchliffe, Peter Jackson, really doing a review of public engagement and to look at how really to identify possible issues when undertaking public engagement, especially for policymakers, of course, DEFRA in the first instance. But I think this does have broader applicability for other policymakers, other forms of engagement. And that's to say also that we looked at citizen science as one type of public engagement. I think, as probably many people are aware, there's a broad range of participatory activities underway. We've heard about some of them. We met with expert witness groups to really talk about their experience in this area. So we had people coming from participatory planning, citizen science, people who'd worked with citizen assemblies, sortition, and citizen juries. So this is really a kind of fascinating scan, I think, with all of this expertise brought in to look at public engagement, processes of public engagement, what some of the issues might be. And we really identified, of course, I suppose, as you would imagine, there's no one size fits all. Publics are diverse. It really can be beneficial to get to know what communities are already doing and build capacity from existing networks, which can help to sustain initiatives beyond the life of a research project. So this provides some of those recommendations. And just to note that there are several case studies, and air pollution is one of them. Here, comparing citizen juries in Kingston in London, Southwest London, citizen sensing, here you can see with the dust box, and also citizen mapping, with a shout out to Louise Francis and Mookie, who have worked on this at UCL. So we really look at the evaluation of how different types of public engagement can also bring different contributions. And this is something to consider when designing engagement activities and thinking about types of citizen involvement and the kinds of actions that might be proposed, and also how to sustain those initiatives. So I just want to thank the contributors also to ERKIT, postdocs Joanne Armitage and Sashit Mahajan, and you've also heard that this had ERC funding. So thanks very much. Look forward to hearing also from the next person. Yes, thanks for that question. I think this is an important area to consider when the topic can be so much more sort of politically charged, for instance, than Zooniverse type examples of citizen science. And I mean, I think this is in part what drew us to this area, because citizen science was always coming up also with questions of environmental justice and so on. And of course, policymakers and regulators in particular, and industry can have the expectation that if citizens are monitoring, they're automatically cooking the books and getting the data that they want to see. But we didn't find that that was the case at all. In fact, quite the contrary, where people wanted to do a robust study and have university people involved to show that it was what they called hard data in some instances, so that they could be taken seriously. So it was quite interesting from a sociological perspective to see how processes of making evidence and of collecting data and verifying that data and analyzing it really became tools for people to make political claims and advance campaigns that they felt weren't being listened to for various reasons. So, you know, in the Southeast London example, there was a group wanting to protect a green space from housing development, and they had hired a pro bono architect to come up with some alternative plans. And then they also used the air quality data to show that the green space was important as a buffer from the A2, a very busy roadway with very high levels of air pollution. They didn't succeed in that campaign, but it was interesting to see how, rather than it being a sort of trigger or something that distorted their approach, in fact, it became something that almost made their practices more methodical. And that, I think, was also because we very much included them in the entire data process, from setting up the devices to running sort of tutorial workshops in how to look at air quality data, because it's not intuitive, and we had to learn that ourselves. We're not atmospheric scientists, but we did work with atmospheric scientists to sort of set up a toolkit that people could use. And then to look at how to narrate the results. So before we launched in sort of Southeast London example, before ERKIT, when we launched the findings, we worked with the community to look at the preliminary results and write action points together. So you know, there were a broad number of groups. There was no single sort of campaign underway, and there were some who were successfully engaging the council in coming up with alternative transport plans, and they subsequently received some funding for that. So people were putting forward action points on the basis of the data and using that to really support their claims. So I would say that including people in the data process, from the installation, collection, analysis to action points, can be a really interesting way that then they think about how to organize their campaigns. Not that the data has to be the only thing that is of value when informing what they want to see in built environments, but that process can be one of mutual learning and exchange rather than distortion or bias.
Hi everyone, my name is Achla Joshi and I am a policy analyst at Health Canada, working in a Office of Science Policy Liaison and Coordination in a Healthy Environments and Consumer Safety branch. So I wanted to start with providing a little bit of context. I know most of the presentations today are really focused on the UK perspective, but I'm coming from a Health Canada and Government of Canada perspective. So it's important to provide a little bit of context and to know that the Government of Canada and specifically Health Canada is really behind when it comes to supporting citizen science or participatory research. When you do a simple Google search of citizen science and Government of Canada, very, very few results come up. One of the few that does is what is called a citizen science portal, and it is hosted on a Government of Canada webpage, but it's really a repository of projects, hyperlinks leading people to other projects on other pages. And of the projects listed on it, less than a third are actually led by government departments and agencies. Despite this, we know that citizen science projects are underway. They're perhaps just not on this portal, which is our only limited web presence for the Government of Canada. But it's all being done in silos. There's no formal infrastructure, guidance, or policy to support our federal researchers in the uptake of participatory research. So with this in mind, our team put forth a commitment in Canada's National Action Plan on Open Government to really develop and test an infrastructure to facilitate the uptake of citizen science in a health research context. So early stages of this work was really around exploring the issue. Why wasn't Health Canada really adopting citizen science, and what was really needed to address that gap? So part of this work involved doing a bit of an environmental scan. Again, we're really behind when it comes to developing formalized best practices and guidance, which means there's a lot for us to beg, borrow, and steal from internationally when it comes to advancing this. We've also pulled together groups of subject matter experts to discuss these issues from a Health Canada perspective. There was talk in earlier presentations about IT infrastructure and the importance of having a platform to allow for longevity and follow-up of projects down the road. And we also did some significant stakeholder research, and I want to spend a little bit of time going through what we heard with that. So we sent out some surveys to a small sampling of federal employees, primarily from Health Canada, as well as conducted a handful of follow-up interviews. And these are really to dive into people's awareness or understanding of citizen science and what they felt they needed to support them in the uptake of citizen science. And across the board, there was high interest in citizen science, and most people, around 80%, felt that there were goals, priorities, or needs in their program area that could be supported by this approach. But it was really interesting for us to know that by far the top perceived benefit of citizen science was the ability to collect data and information from remote locations and from marginalized or vulnerable populations. In a country as geographically and culturally diverse as Canada, this is often one of the biggest challenges to any research where we need public involvement, or even geographic information. It's so resource intensive to collect this data from across such a broad geographic region and to get a representative sampling from the diversity of the Canadian population. However, when we asked about their previous experience with public engagement projects, one of the top challenges were really around low recruitment, low response rates, and a lack of participant diversity. Similarly, when we asked theoretically about challenges moving forward with the citizen science project, people felt that there would be challenges around participant recruitment and participant diversity. There was also a lot of feedback from the federal employees that better support was needed, more awareness, dedicated staff, resources, and a platform to ensure consistency and visibility would be key requirements to support them in advancing with a citizen science approach. Similarly, we sent out surveys to the public, wanting to know the other user group in a citizen science project, what their interests, what they perceived as motivators and barriers to participating in citizen science research. I will note that this was a fairly biased group of survey respondents, we reached out through Health Canada's consultation and stakeholder management information system. So this is a group of people that have already agreed to participate in Health Canada research, and we reach out to this group when we have consultations to do as a department. So it's a fairly biased group of people, but even then there seemed to be fairly low familiarity and low experience with participating in citizen science. We also asked them about motivators, and these are probably not surprising to most people on the call. People felt that their top motivators would be to contribute to an important topic, something that's meaningful to them, or learning more about a topic of interest to them. In fact, 82% of all the respondents said they would be interested in an educational component to accompany any citizen science project. Also, unsurprisingly, top barriers that would discourage participation really focused on communication-related issues when there was a lack of clarity around objectives, outcomes, low communication with the organizers of a project, substantial reading or training. Again, this is not new and is certainly well captured in a lot of literature exploring these issues already. One of the areas that I do want to focus on a little bit is the fact that we asked some demographic questions in this survey as well. And less than 12% of respondents identified as racialized or visible minorities. And this is quite a bit less than the 22% in the Canadian population. Similarly, we had less than 2% of respondents identify as having Indigenous ancestry. And again, this is 5% of the Canadian population. And again, another demographic was almost half of respondents had a master's degree or higher. So very highly educated percentage of the population. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but these are just the key findings and the key path forward for us as a result of the stakeholder research, and has really led us to where we are now in this project. We know that developing some sort of an IT infrastructure will be central to the visibility and awareness and consistency of citizen science for the Government of Canada. We know that tools and resources need to be developed for the Health Canada or Government of Canada context. But we also know that increased focus needs to be put on these big questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is still a major gap. We know that this is a high area of priority or perceived benefit of citizen science, but we're still not at a point where we know how to bridge that gap. We have done a lot of research today on what this IT infrastructure could look like, but as a government agency, there are still a lot of strict requirements around accessibility, language requirements, ensuring that we maintain and manage data appropriately, securely, maintaining people's privacy. And these are all questions we're continuing to explore. A very text-heavy slide, but all to say is that we're working on building a toolkit for Health Canada. And so much of this is borrowing and stealing from what is all the great work that has already been done internationally. A lot of you will see hyperlinks as a part of this toolkit that you have maybe even been a part of developing. But there's a lot of unique context at Health Canada in health research, specifically when it comes to questions around ethics and privacy that become a lot more tricky than when you're reporting photos of flora or fauna, for example. But also we are looking to develop guidance really to bridge that gap when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And a really particular part of that in the Canadian context is around Indigenous interests and values. So in Canada, Indigenous peoples are unique rights holders. So they have unique data sovereignty principles where they actually retain ownership of their data if they choose to share it with government. There's also different ways of knowing and different knowledge systems in Indigenous communities. And this was kind of talked about in other talks earlier about the Western science approach and how limiting that can sometimes be in terms of the ability to collect knowledge and rich information when we adhere to the strict science methodology that Western science is familiar with. So instead of adding an Indigenous lens after we've built and launched this project, we really want to engage these Indigenous voices, the Indigenous perspectives, right at the outset and development of the IT platform of these guidance pieces. So this has led us to where we're looking for additional funding at this point in our project. We've just put in a request for substantial funding to do some formal public opinion research where we're actually oversampling traditional underrepresented parts of the communities. So what are the barriers and motivators for rural populations, for lower educated families? Again, this is not new research, but we're looking specifically at the Canadian context to better understand how we can reach these underrepresented parts of the population. We're also looking for funding to build contracts with Indigenous organizations and people and communities. to really explore some of these big questions about what a citizen science model will mean for Indigenous populations in Canada, and how we can advance the sort of a model that respects data ownership and sovereignty in the Indigenous context. Also looking at how stakeholder networks might really serve as great liaisons where their trust is already established with some of these communities, where there's ongoing dialogue, ongoing communication, and there's perhaps a lack of trust with government agencies coming in and dictating how research should be done. I won't spend too much time going through each of the pilot projects. Today has been a big session in successful pilot projects, and we're not at that point yet. But we are looking to test the guidance and the policy that we're developing with pilot projects. These are going to be iterative policy pieces that will evolve and learn, that we hope to learn and grow from as a result of these pilot projects. In particular, food choices in northern communities will be a really great opportunity for us to work with Inuit communities in northern rural populations in Canada and really explore some of those big questions around Indigenous principles, perspectives, and values. So hopefully I kept that within 10 minutes, but I'm hopeful that there's some time for questions. But my email address is there on the screen now. Happy to continue conversation on this outside of the event today. Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely early conversations as well as in our formal survey and in the interviews. We actually had a couple of people who were very passionate and very nervous about using citizens' data to inform health policy, and a lot of nervous people, and to some extent with good reason. But I think that there's so much evidence and so much literature that we can bombard people with to show that this is simply not the case. I mean, the air quality example is exactly that. You know, people have this perception that, you know, there's a few loud vocal people against anything that government is going to do, and they seem to make a lot of researchers nervous about, you know, then going back to these perceived loud voices to then collect the data to inform our policy. But evidence suggests that it's not these people who are participating, and certainly when you're collecting thousands of participants' data, the robustness just overwhelms those few small, often loud voices in the data that's being collected. There's also so many ways of designing a citizen science project that negate some of those biases that you know, involving instrumentation as opposed to, you know, personal testimonies or experiences, or combining the two of them, because I think there's a richness to storytelling that the sheer data doesn't always collect. But using these in tandem really negates, there's just so much overwhelming evidence to suggest that data quality with the right project design, with the sheer amount of data that can be collected via citizen science, negates any of those data quality issues. No more than any research being conducted. There, you know, there's bias by any researcher. Even if you go in and control everything you think you can, you're still collecting blanks, you're still collecting duplicates, you're still doing all of these things to ensure data quality that would carry through to any citizen science project as well.